Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line in favor of the Russians. Russians managed to advance in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, in the southern and northern flanks of Pokrovsk. Numerous advances between Pokrovsk and Kostyantynivka as Russians begin the battle for the operational encirclement of the city on the southern flank. The Russians also managed to advance in the direction of the supply lines of Lyman in the northwestern direction of the town. The Russians also managed to advance in the Sumi region, looking to gain control over the logistical hub in the area. Starting out in the southern section of the front line, the Russians continued their advances towards the town of Kostyantynivka in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. The Russians managed to capture a fortified position to the south of the town as they develop offensive operations to the south and to the east of it. Russians are fighting over the fortified positions on the outskirts of the town, looking to gain full control of it and continue offensive operations along the first and second lines of defense of the Ukrainians within the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia regions. In the southern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to advance, gaining control of additional parts of the southwestern outskirts of the city as they slowly advanced to secure a supply road directly into the city. The Russians have now secured more of the western flank as they continue advancing alongside the western flank to gain full control over the additional highway leading into the city, but also creating a buffer zone between the main supply route that goes through Troyanda here in the southwest and into the Shakhtarsky district between the Russian and Ukrainian positions on the flank to secure the forces moving through these residential areas as they build up forces towards the central parts of the city. In the northern flank of the city, the Russians managed to gain control over the eastern parts of Chervony Lyman. Gaining control over the eastern parts allowed the Russians to develop offensive operations on the southern flank of Rodinsk. Russians are slowly advancing on the northern, eastern, and southern flanks of Rodinsk to start the battle over the town, which had a pre-war population of approximately 10,000 people. Gaining control over Rodinsk will allow the Russians to develop offensive operations towards the northern flank of Pokrovsk, secure the main supply route on the northern flank between Rodinsk and Dobropilya in the northern direction, and also allow the Russians to develop offensive operations towards the last positions of the Ukrainians along the western flank of Pokrovsk for a operational encirclement of the city. Further north, the Russians develop offensive operations in the direction of Novoshakhove and securing the flanks of the offensive operations in the northern direction, bypassing the town of Dobropilya by moving alongside the positions here in between Dobropilya and the road towards Droshkivka. Russians are here developing offensive operations to cut off all of the roads between the Kostyantynivka line and the western parts of Pokrovsk. This is both to limit the supplies that goes through to the Kostyantynivka line, gaining control by having drones within range of all of these highways, and also isolating the eastern and western parts of the Donetsk region will allow the Russians to focus on one of these sides. Russians can choose to focus on the western parts of the Donetsk region to gain control over the entire area by isolating it from the Kostyantynivka line, bypassing the last remaining fortified positions of the Ukrainians on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, and to gain full control over the cities of Pokrovsk and Mirnogorod in the frontline positions. These Russian operations on the northern flank of Pokrovsk paved the way for such operations. The main fighting of the Russians are now directed at Belitske, Rodinsk, and Ryshine, which all supply Pokrovsk, as well as the storming of Pokrovsk from the south and west. To the east of these locations, the Russians have managed to gain control over the northern flank of Poltavka along the river lines, as well as expanding the zone of control east of Chasiv Yar, gaining control over additional fortified positions and developing offensive operations towards the settlements of Roshkishne, Topabelka, and Stepanivka. Russians are advancing along the fortified positions in the southern flank of the town and capturing fortified positions in the western flank of it, as they are developing offensive operations to gain control over the road connecting Topabelka with the western parts along the defensive line, and also to gain control over supply lines that lead into these settlements from the western and southern directions as they develop offensive operations on the western flank of Kostyantynivka for the operational encirclement of the city. Russians gain control over Mykolaiy-Pilya, Roshkishne, Novobelka, and Stepanivka, the last 4 settlements on the western flank of Kostyantynivka that isn't directly connected to the city, will allow the Russians to gain fire control over the western highway of Kostyantynivka, which would leave just the positions west of Chasiv Yar. To gain control over those positions will allow the Russians to gain full fire control and operational encirclement over Kostyantynivka with long-range strikes. The Russians have a unique opportunity in this section of the front line, and that is the fact that the offensive operations on the northern flank of Pokrovsk also can develop in the direction of Droshkivka along the defensive line of the Ukrainians. The Russians gaining control over the defensive line between Droshkivka and Pokrovsk will allow them to start a battle over Droshkivka itself. If the Russians develop offensive operations on the northern flank of Chasiv Yar along the railway area, they can also develop offensive operations on the eastern flank of Droshkivka, which can allow the Russians to not just operationally encircle Kostyantynivka, but all the way up to Droshkivka as well, making half of the Sloviansk-Kostyantynivka line under a Russian operational encirclement. This is why the developments taking place in between Kostyantynivka and Pokrovsk, which are now completely out of Ukrainian controls with the rapid advances of the Russians in this section of the front line compared to any other section of the front line, shows that the Russians are prioritizing this section over other sections as it gives many more opportunities and possibilities for the army, and at the same time the Ukrainian defenses here have not stabilized after weeks of fighting, which shows that the majority of the forces are instead focusing on other sectors such as Kostyantynivka and Pokrovsk, as well as the Sumi region in the north. With regards to the city of Pokrovsk, the Russians are now 9 kilometers from the tightest spot, from physically encircling Mirnorad and Pokrovsk and meeting the northern and southern tips of the front line. Moving further north in the direction of the Serbets River line and the western flank of Lyman, the Russians are moving towards cutting off the first road of the 3 roads supplying Lyman from the west. The Russians have now reached the road itself by gaining a foothold within the town of Encircle, as we see with this geolocated footage. Based on these developments, we see the Russians are now working on cutting off the first of 3 main roads that supplies Lyman from the northwest. Russians are now storming Encircle and Srechne. Gaining control over both of these settlements will allow the Russians to have a strong western flank for offensive operations to go further towards the town of Lyman, developing offensive operations in the direction of Novoselivka and Yarova in the southwest. Will allow the Russians to cut off all of the supply roads that lead into Lyman from the northwestern direction and create a buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian forces in the western direction of the town. This will allow the Russians to launch offensive operations with their main forces through Sarishne in the east and Stavki in the north towards Lyman, all while limiting the supplies that goes into the town from the northwestern direction, leaving only the southwestern and southeastern supply lines to supply Lyman from the Siversk and Sloviansk directions. These can also be limited by Russian strikes along the river lines, limiting the supplies that goes across. At the same time, the Russian offensive operations being developed in the Sirpiansky Forest area. Covering the first area will allow the Russians to infiltrate the southeastern flank of Lyman as well, to fight over the fortified positions in the forest area, and to allow the Russian forces to launch drone strikes on the town itself. Further north in the Sumi region, the Russian offensive operations continue in the direction of Yablonivka as they look to gain full control over the town. The Russians managed to gain control over parts of the forest patch in the southwestern outskirts of the town, looking to cut off the supply roads that lead into the town, as the Ukrainians are sending reinforcements to counterattack in the direction of Yablonivka to secure their positions in the area. The Russians are looking to cut off the supplies, gain control over the remaining parts, and establish a defensive line on the outskirts of it. All to establish a logistical hub for their forces here within the Sumi region, to gain control over the eastern flank with regards to Sadki, and to develop offensive operations along the highway to the next line of defense of the Ukrainians between Khotin in the west and Marine in the east. In the eastern section of the front line, the Russians are fighting over the town of Ekaterinivka on the outskirts of Donetsk. Here, the Ukrainians are continuously launching counterattacks to regain control over the town and push the Russians out, as the Russians are looking to establish themselves within the southern and western parts of the town. Their position on the high ground allows the Russians to overlook the settlements and remaining residential areas where the Ukrainian presence is still existent, while they are withdrawing to the fortified positions. The Ukrainians are counterattacking to prevent the Russians from overlooking these fortified positions and forcing further withdrawals. Instead, they are concentrating their forces in the region of Kostyantynivka to face off against the Russian forces to secure a safe withdrawal for their forces from the remaining parts of the pocket, here to the west of the city. In the Pokrovsk direction, although the Russians continue offensive operations towards the city itself, according to a Russian source, the Ukrainians are still present within Svirove and Leontovichi. The way they are present is that they are located in some of the basements, and the Russians are clearing them day by day to gain rid of the remaining forces the Ukrainians have present within the area. However, the Ukrainians are able to supply them with drones for water, ammunition, food, allowing them to stay and fight for as long as possible. While the Russians continue to develop offensive operations, they are looking to gain control over as vast an area as possible before clearing the areas, as the Russians do not see them posing too much of a threat. Instead, the Russians are developing offensive operations in the region of the Shakhtarsk district and on the flanks to prevent more organized and larger Ukrainian counterattacks rather than small dispersed ambushes. Not to mention the differences between the assault troops, which continue to attack and advance within the city, and the ones who are supposed to secure their positions. These soldiers are better equipped to deal with these stragglers compared to the assault troops, who are supposed to break into buildings and take control over areas, hold them until the reinforcements arrive to stabilize the situation. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.